In July 1969, a human stepped onto the moon. But if you strip away the pathos of the phrase, "one small step for man," the picture becomes much more interesting and much stranger. It was not a single mission, but an entire series of risky experiments on the edge of catastrophe and miracle, stretched over just 3 years. Imagine, 6 crewed landings on the moon in such a short time. Today that sounds almost like science fiction. Each mission was its own story, where people were testing not only hardware, but also the limits of human luck. Back then, it seemed like this was only the beginning of a long road to the stars. But that road ended almost as abruptly as it began. The moon was already ours, and we left it. Half a century ago, humanity walked away from the lunar surface, leaving flags, footprints, and a silent question behind. Are we coming back? Or was that a one-time flash of a civilization that is no longer capable of reaching its own past greatness again? Today, humanity is once again looking at the moon. Only this time, the goal is not to prove that we can, but to understand whether we can stay in space for the long term at all. This is a story about returning, about the Artemis program, and about why this new flight to the moon is not nostalgia for Apollo, but an exam for the future of our species. Or why we need the moon again. At first glance, the moon looks like a completed level. We've been there, we've walked on its surface, we've brought back rocks and dust. Documentaries show the same shots over and over. A footprint in gray regolith, a flag, an astronaut hopping around. It seems like there's nothing left to add. But from the perspective of long-term survival of a civilization, the moon is not just a pretty backdrop for a flag, but the nearest test range to learn how to live off Earth. It's like the closest inhospitable island where a species must learn to survive if it ever plans to venture into the open ocean. The moon is a training ground for Mars. If we can't establish ourselves 3 days' flight from home, talking about colonizing other worlds is pointless. It's easier to return from there, easier to evacuate, easier to debug mistakes. The moon has resources. Water in the form of ice in polar craters, regolith that can be turned into building materials, and potential propellant for future interplanetary flights. It's not just a dead rock, but a warehouse of things that could one day feed an interplanetary economy. The moon is an ideal scientific platform. Radio silence on the far side, a stable surface for telescopes, and access to the oldest geological memory of the solar system. What is stored in lunar rocks is an archive of the first hundreds of millions of years of our system's history, long erased on Earth by tectonics and erosion. There is also another, less obvious meaning. The moon is a psychological test. Can humanity accept the idea that there is a place in the sky where someone constantly lives and works, not for a few days, but for years? It changes our sense of scale. The universe stops being just a picture and becomes a space where the species has a second point of support. If the Apollo era was about a symbolic flag, then Artemis is about the question: can humanity actually become a long-lived spacefaring civilization, or will it remain a planetary flash? Now, from Apollo to Artemis, changing the logic. In the 1960s, space was an arena of the Cold War, a competition of systems, a demonstration of power, a technological leap for the sake of status. Apollo was built around one simple goal: land a human on the moon and bring them back alive. That's it. It was one giant leap, and no one was seriously planning a smooth, methodical aftertaste in the form of decades of lunar bases. Today's world is different. We already have the ISS, private companies, robotic missions to Mars and beyond. Space is no longer the exclusive toy of two superpowers, and a new lunar project cannot just be a restoration of the old triumph. No one will pay for decades just for a pretty shot of a flag on the horizon. The logic has changed. Then, one huge, incredibly expensive leap. Now, gradual buildup of infrastructure and repeatability. We need missions that can be launched on a schedule, not only when the world spends half a year preparing for one liftoff. Then, expendable rockets and lunar modules burned for the sake of the race. Now, a bet on partial reusability, lower launch costs, and partnership with the private sector. Space is shifting from a purely military project to a mixture of science, business, and a new kind of geopolitics. Then, a symbolic flag and a few short walks in the dust. Now, long-duration missions around the South Pole, base construction, preparation for permanent presence. The point is no longer to prove, but to settle in. Artemis is not a replay of Apollo, but an experiment. Can humanity operate in space not as a temporary guest, but as a cautious yet serious neighbor? If Apollo was a burst of fireworks, Artemis is trying to become a dim but steady lamp that burns not for a minute, but for decades. That what Artemis actually is behind the pretty name lies a fairly clear architecture. Artemis Coic, an uncrewed test. A new Orion spacecraft, a new super heavy rocket, a new trajectory around the moon. The first question, can we even send a large crew-rated vehicle to the moon again and bring it back? This is a test, not only of hardware, but of whether the current bureaucratic and industrial machine can still pull itself together and do something this complex. Artemis 2. People go to the moon again. The crew will fly around the moon without landing. This is the analog of Apollo 8, testing all systems, communications, radiation exposure, the human factor in the new architecture. For viewers, it may look less spectacular, but this is exactly where all the small details get polished, the ones life on the surface will later depend on. Artemis 3, the moment a human steps onto regolith again. But not in 1960s style. The landing is planned in the South Polar region, where lunar ice hides in eternal shadow. Instead of a classic lunar module, there will be a commercial lander. And in the crew, there will be not only military test pilots, but representatives of a new generation, women, scientists, people who symbolize a shift in era and agenda. Then, more. The Gateway Lunar Orbital Station, a waypoint in cislunar space, a logistics and scientific hub. Different spacecraft can dock there, crews can be rotated, experiments can be run in deep space conditions without landing on the moon every time. Surface infrastructure, power, communications, shelters, life support. Not a temporary camp, but the seed of a permanent base. This is no longer a mountaineer's tent camp, but the first support of a future settlement. Every step of Artemis is not a one-off stunt for the news cycle, but a brick in the foundation of a possible lunar society of the future. Yes, that still sounds grandiose, but that's how new civilizational tiers start. First a few modules, a couple of expeditions per year, and then suddenly, the map no longer shows nothing but a network of routes and outposts. The moon as an exam for civilization. In great filter scenarios, one idea often appears. Civilizations die out shortly before breaking into deep space. They manage to create dangerous technologies but don't manage to learn how to handle themselves. Their rockets haven't even started leaving their system en masse, and everything back home is already burning. In that context, returning to the moon is not just an engineering project but a symptom. Are we really ready for the next level? Or is all of this just the last fireworks before an internal collapse? The moon becomes a kind of checkpoint. Can we manage to turn it into a foothold before our own earthly problems cut our wings? The moon is a perfect mirror for our weaknesses and strengths. There is no atmosphere, no magnetic field, no margin for sloppy decisions. Any carelessness is an instant game over. No, maybe we'll get away with it. Vacuum does not forgive statistical compromises. You can't hide behind political slogans there. Either the system works in vacuum and radiation, or it doesn't. It doesn't matter which flag is on your spacesuit. It becomes obvious that large-scale space projects require cooperation between nations, companies, and disciplines. You can't get there alone anymore. Otherwise, it will be another short, expensive, beautiful, but one-off leap. Artemis shows whether we are capable of coordinating complex programs over decades, not election cycles. Negotiating with the private sector without turning space into a pure market of one-time contracts. Thinking about the safety not only of the current crew, but of future off-world residents. What makes Artemis different from Apollo's romance? The Apollo era is archival footage, black and white newsreels, iconic quotes. The Artemis era may look much less romantic on the surface, but be far more important in essence. Video of solar farms unfolding and regolith being drilled isn't as stunning as the first step on the moon, but that is where real colonization hides, not just a symbolic moment. A few key differences. Focus on duration. The goal is not just to reach the finish line and collapse, but to stay on the track. The lunar program should no longer suddenly end with, "We're shutting down. There's no money." Focus on infrastructure. Power systems, logistics, comms, reusability. Boring words without which any beautiful landing becomes a dead end. Without them, a base remains stage scenery. Focus on preparing the next step. Everything done on the moon is treated as rehearsal, extracting resources, building shelters, shielding from radiation, maintaining human psychology far from Earth. This is no longer about heroism, but about the routine of a new environment. In this sense, Artemis is not about one more victory, but about the question, is humanity ready to become something more than just an intelligent species tied to a single planet? Why it matters. Right now, the world is going through another wave of instability. Climate, geopolitics, technological risks. It's easy to say, we have no time for the moon, fix Earth first. And in some sense, that's a fair remark. But in the context of Artemis, the moon is not an escape from reality, but a test. Can we even do long, complex, risky projects that extend beyond a single generation? It's the ability to think not just until the next crisis or election, but on a scale of decades. If a civilization forgets how to think that way, no amount of green transitions or digital transformations will save it. If we are not capable of keeping focus for decades, setting long-term goals, and investing in them even when there's no instant payoff, then our chances of passing that same filter evaporate very quickly. The moon as the first step to a spacefaring society. You can look at Artemis as an expensive PR stunt, or you can see it as humanity's first attempt to build a stable branch of development beyond its home planet. Lunar ice can become a source of water, oxygen, and rocket fuel. That means future spacecraft may refuel not only on Earth. Local resources might allow us to build things without hauling every bolt from Earth. that lowers the cost of every next step. Lunar orbit is a convenient hub for future missions to Mars and beyond. From there, you don't have to claw your way out of Earth's deep gravity well. If we manage to turn the moon from a place where heroes once visited into a place where someone is always working, exploring, and living, it will mean just one thing. We have taken the first step from a planetary civilization to an interplanetary one. Once, the last words spoken by a human on the moon carried a quiet hope that we would return. For half a century, the moon remained silent. Now we are preparing to go back, not for slogans, but to confront the most uncomfortable question. Are we capable of going beyond our own limit at all? Or will we remain a civilization that once lifted its eyes to the sky, touched it, and never learned to live beyond its homeworld? How the Artemis era unfolds will decide whether the moon becomes our first reliable foothold in space, or a monument to how far we once reached and how quickly we let go.